everybody. I think we may just be waiting on a couple of folks to kind of sign in. I know it takes a minute for the participants to just trickle in here. So while we're doing that, I will start with a brief introduction of myself, the meetup, and then Maureen, and we'll get into the discussion and we'll get going. So with that, first of all, really appreciate everybody coming out tonight, even virtually. I know there's a lot that everybody has going on these days, so it means a lot that you're spending your time with us. Also, quick note, because we always forget to do this, but if there's anything you want to comment on via Twitter, just use the hashtag NY Media Meetup, and we'll see it and we'll try and promote it and maybe take some questions that way as well. But back to the introduction and where you all are and what you're participating in. So I am JJ Colao. I currently run a public relations firm called Haymaker Group. We work with tech companies here in New York and around the world, some of which you may have heard of, like HubSpot or Angie or Waster. And we're always looking to speak with great PR folks if any of you happen to be out there. The other kind of relevant bit of background I want to share is before starting Haymaker, was a reporter at Forbes, so covered startups, venture capital, technology, that whole world. And we began the New York Media Meetup back in 2014 when I left Forbes to start Haymaker, just to make sure that we had conversations with reporters and spoke about topics related to the craft or the business of journalism, kind of quarter in and quarter out. So if that sounds interesting to you, join us, read our emails, come to other events, and hopefully you'll get a lot out of it. So with that, I am very excited to be joined by Maureen Farrell, who is now a New York Times reporter, and I think objectively one of the best business reporters in the country. So a bit of background for Maureen: began her career covering M&A and bankruptcy for first Merger Market and then Debtwire, sort of respectively. Moved on to become a staff writer at Forbes, where she worked under my later editor, Brett. Nice mutual connection there. And then that was followed by a stint at CNN, 8 years at the Wall Street Journal, and now she is a business reporter at the New York Times. She's also graciously joining us from maternity leave, so really appreciate that, Maureen. And of course, you are the co-author of the amazingly fantastic book, The Cult of We. So I have my hard copy here with me, and I do encourage everybody right now to go buy a copy if you have not. And Maureen, if you'll bear with me, I want to read through just a couple of accolades, because it really is as good as business books get, I think, and I read a lot of them. So John Helier, who is the legendary co-author of Barbarians at the Gate, said it's one of the few books that capture the zeitgeist of a business era, and he would certainly know that. The New York Times review is glowing and worth reading in its own right. Harvard Business Review called it deeply reported and compellingly written. Matt Levine called it a riveting and definitive account of WeWork, one of the wildest business stories of our time. And if you are at all familiar with the story, you will know that that is not an exaggeration. It has obviously also been turned into, not the book itself, but the story that is described in the book, a very popular and surprisingly well done Apple Plus TV show called WeCrashed. So I think that speaks to how alluring this story all is. So with that, Maureen, I would love for you to maybe just take us back to the beginning and sort of set the scene and tell us about how WeWork came onto your radar and how you began, this long and ultimately fruitful relationship with the company.
Sure. So maybe I'll start. It predates me. When I was working at the Wall Street Journal, before I really started covering it, I literally was just reading in like shock and awe some of the stories that my colleague and co-author, my former colleague and co-author Eliot Brown was writing about WeWork. He was our real estate reporter. He covered commercial real estate in New York. And I think around 2013, 2014, he was hearing all about this guy, Adam Newman, just met him kind of on a whim. And I think I think he actually went into the office, met him. Adam was like, as you know, as much of an eccentric character and amusing as you can imagine, even back then. And just to say what I've heard him say, that he kind of just step by step, bit by bit, became confounded by the valuation of the company covering commercial real estate. It was like, how is this company going up in value more and more and more? I came on the scene, fast forward maybe about 5 years later, 4 years later, 2017, 18, 19, I was covering the IPO market. But a lot at the Wall Street Journal was, sort of focused on the biggest companies like the Ubers, Airbnbs, covering them as private companies about to make their way into the public markets. So as we all know, that it was like a new era of private companies. We've never seen them raise as much money as they had. We never saw them as big, doing really groundbreaking things. WeWork, even back then, everyone would talk about them in a different way with this eccentric CEO, how much cash they were burning through, which even compared to like an Uber was really extreme. So that's really when I started covering them. I would, go in and see the company. I was also very focused on SoftBank, who became their biggest backer. So I was starting to report on some of the deals that SoftBank, some of the infusions of money, because it was also some of the largest private fundraising we'd ever seen. So that's pretty much how I came upon them. And I would say by 2018 into 2019, really started very kind of actively covering them, because that was when this huge deal with SoftBank we were reporting a lot on was going to be the biggest private deal ever that could have kept WeWork as a private company forever and made Adam Newman and Masayoshi Son almost like even partners in WeWork. They're going to take over the world basically and have limitless capital to do so. That fell apart, and then they were about to go off to the races to the IPO market. So it was sort of the beginning of the end, so to speak, in late 2018.
That is an interesting point to come in. So it sounds like Eliot was aware of them just by virtue of being immersed in New York City real estate and the real estate markets in general, which is where they began, sort of as they began in that context, doing deals with, different owners and that sort of thing. And then as they really started to get notoriety as a result of the incredible amounts of money that they were raising, and in tandem with that, sort of the lack of a actual, technology business, that's when they sort of came on your radar, it sounds like.
Exactly. And just to give, credit where credit's due, Eliot, I would say, was one of the few, when you talk about the notoriety, if you look back in that era, I mean, Adam Newman was so celebrated, including on the cover of our, the magazine, which we left. He was, really lauded and on the cover of Forbes as this sort of phenom, this like brilliant entrepreneur who's going to shake up the world of real estate. And it wasn't just Forbes. I mean, you spent endless amount of times. The coverage was so glowing of what he was going to do. And Eliot was like this sort of like person that like everyone at the company was like driving everyone crazy. Adam was kind of obsessing over him because he was like poking holes and questioning the business and writing some of really the only critical articles, and had begun pointing out some of like the insanity that was Adam Newman, like the tequila and the just different aspects that became part of the whole bigger story. So that was before I came on the scene.
Yeah, and I remember following that trajectory in real time, and actually doing it from a WeWork where I was working at the time, and I'm actually coming to everybody live from a WeWork currently, where our office is, as I mentioned to Maureen prior to us joining, great product. It's just not $100 billion company. So it sounds like, you all were covering and interacting with WeWork, via your different beats. When did you have the conversation with Eliot where you all decided to kind of, tackle this together, not just the book, but also the reporting for the journal, sort of as the story was taking shape?
It happened like kind of organically, like the SoftBank, I was sort of, and not just me, but some other colleagues at the journal, we all sort of joined forces. We're getting tips on this SoftBank big deal at the end of 2018, writing about various aspects of it. But by 2019, I would say the first moment where I think we really joined forces in kind of an intense way to cover the story was over the summer of 2019. I got a tip from someone, and this is something that Eliot had been following for a long time, that Adam Neumann had basically, sold or borrowed against the company almost $1 billion. And it was something that, Eliot had been told wasn't even the case. He had been it had been, the company and others had told him he was wrong. He had written about lesser amounts. So we started putting that together. And it seemed, at the moment, it was in the summer before we knew the IPO was coming by then in a couple of months. I think this was around June 2019. And we actually wound up writing, it was like more than 700 million, because we got a little pushback, even though it was ultimately more than $1 billion or around that. And again, stock sales and loans. And it felt, when I first heard it, and like when we first talked about it, it was like, oh my God, this is so much. And then you're working on it for a while, really trying to confirm it. And it's like, you're so focused on the story, you forget, like, maybe it's not that crazy. And then I just remember the moment the story went out, like it just sort of like reverberated, and there was like kind of collective horror about it. And so then it was like, from there, we just both had different stories we were working on. But we joined forces, like, in so many different ones. And as it got closer to the failed IPO, like around the time the prospectus, the S1 that showed all the details of the company in August of 2019, for the next like month or so, as the IPO is falling apart, it was funny, like Eliot was in California, and sometimes it would be like 9:00 my time here, and we would have talked like multiple times already, because things were happening so quickly, and it was just, it didn't follow any playbook that I had ever seen. I'd covered so many IPOs at that point.
Certainly not comparable to any IPO I'm familiar with, although things have changed, I guess, a little bit with the SPACs in the last 2 years or so. But also, for everybody listening, want to make clear, it is not typical for a pre-IPO founder to take $700 million out of the company and sell that amount of equity, or $1 billion.
Yeah.
Or borrow. I mean, it was like half a billion in equity sales and $500 million in a credit line, or something to that effect.
Yeah, roughly.
Which is astounding in and of itself. And then I love the fact that you mentioned you almost had doubts at one point, which I think speaks to the sort of reality distortion field that they were very effective at creating. Adam, it seems like, especially, is just, a master at that. But it really is. Also, that is one of 50 unbelievable anecdotes, I think, that illustrate just the amazing story that WeWork is.
That was some of the fun of writing the book, I have to say, is like every time we thought we had already heard the craziest story we could have heard, it felt like it was starting to happen like every day at points of reporting the story, that then one of us would hear something and just be like, oh my God. And we literally would call, we were reporting from different places, because it was the pandemic too. But we'd call each other and just be like, you will never believe what I just heard. And it's somehow the story kept story kept on getting crazier, and we kept on getting more details of like basically every step of the way of insane things that happened.
I do want to get into some of those because I have my own list, and the marginalia in my copy of the book is, extensive with exclamation points and OMGs and that sort of thing. But before we get into that, I do want to get a sense of what the sort of reporting pattern looked like. So you mentioned that you and Eliot are on different coasts. You're talking multiple times a day, often, well into the evening Eastern time. Can you give us a sense of kind of the timeline? So it seems like pre-IPO, I think summer of 2019, that process goes into the fall. There's obviously a lot of aftermath with SoftBank and everything, but I would love to just hear about kind of what your and Eliot's lives were like during that incredibly intense period when the stories that you were putting out were getting an incredible amount of attention and really, from WeWork's perspective, existential in terms of their impact. And so I would just love to hear about that period.
Sure. I mean, it was just completely insane. And I'll say it was Eliot and I, but there were more colleagues that was the beauty of the Wall Street Journal, that like so many different people had so many different sources. So it was like being able to compile like a whole big team together, I think really gave us such an edge in reporting everything, because people could go to all different people and we could kind of like flood the zone, and things were happening. It was mystifying, as I said, things were happening so quickly. But I guess, I mean, say for that month, like by September, it was getting closer to a potential IPO. And I would say almost every weekend something was supposed to happen, and we'd spend almost like the whole weekend trying to hear things or figure it out. And I'll give you one anecdote. Oh gosh, I can't remember now if this was when, I guess this was with him. They were pushing him, trying to push him out of the company, and we found out on Friday of that. I got a tip on like Thursday or Friday, and this was like in mid-September. The IPO was about to happen, and I may be mixing up the timeline a little bit, so apologies. But it was basically like inconceivable at that point that Adam could ever step down. He had all the voting control. It looked like the IPO was going to be a disaster, but it was sort of like you couldn't imagine that he could be pushed out of the company. They were going to pause the IPO, and I started hearing things on like a Thursday or Friday. And by the way, this was after Eliot separately, he had been working on this for a really long time, wrote this article, quick backup. He had been working forever on a profile of Adam Neumann, his leadership. And the famous start to the story was Adam Neumann was flying high and talking about how great things were. Also that he was flying to Israel, and there was a box of marijuana, he landed in Israel. Somehow there was a box of marijuana stuffed into the plane, into the private jet, and they weren't allowed to take the jet back. So that story came out. The company was so flipped out about the story leading up to it during fact checking. You could see this in the WeCrashed, some aspects of that. And it was really, starting to dawn on people that once the story comes out, they might not be able to go public. Story comes out. One of my really good sources, who's very not part of the whole deal with WeWork, but a very big figure on Wall Street, calls me, and he said, "I just read your colleague's article. There's no way that the company can ever go public, and there's no way Adam will be CEO within 48 hours." And he said, once, it's like a felony to carry, drugs on an international flight. And it's just reported in the Wall Street Journal that happened. So no banker can underwrite it anymore. Like no one can stand up and sell this company to Wall Street, because they're going to take on too much like liability with it. So I remember calling Eliot, and he was like, "No," and it seemed really extreme to me. And then within a couple of days, we started hearing that it was going to happen. Like someone kind of tipped me off to it. We're calling around. We brought in our colleagues, David Benoit, and who covers banking, and Liz Hoffman, who also covers banking, but they both covered a lot of things. The four of us sort of all had respective sources, and we were kind of working on it all weekend. And then I just remember at some point, like, oh gosh, I can't remember what Liz was doing, but like Dave Benoit was at like a Cubs game, and I forget, like Eliot might have been hiking somewhere in California, and we're all like calling our sources frantically because we also think we're going to get beat potentially on this story. And I think it came out late on like a Sunday, but it always, every single thing felt so frantic. And there was an awesome team of editors, including my former editor, Dana Simaluka, who I would say for a month, I spent like every Friday and Saturday night, Sunday, Monday mornings at 6 a.m. would be calling him like frantically with the tips. And we'd be trying to like figure out how quickly to put things out or what, when we should wait. So it was definitely like a full team effort.
That's very helpful. And I will say one of the characteristics of Adam that came through very strongly in your book is he's a pothead. Like there's no way around it. I remember college and I remember people having habits not unlike his, but it's very unusual for the CEO of a, $50 billion valuation company to have a smoke eater in his office, I think quite literally ingest marijuana every single day, to the extent that he needs it on international flights. So that was also kind of a shocking revelation and backed up by many, many anecdotes in your book as well.
Yeah, that was shocking throughout. And then especially, we can get to the Apple TV show. I actually thought they captured it. It's this weird push-pull because there's he's not whatever you might think like a podhead is or whatever, someone who does this every day. I don't know what you should think of that, but he's not. He also barely sleeps and is so intense and crazy in everything, but I don't know, is this weird thing. But also, we also documented him. You could see it from flight records. So it's he was smoking marijuana a lot and drinking a lot, and whatever that was for. I think at times it was to get people on his team or to shock people, like the tequila shots at 10 a.m. Was somewhat performative almost. But there was the lead up to the IPO. He was in Hawaii, and I don't know if it was Hawaii, but the Dominican Republic. He was in Costa Rica. He went back and forth twice in 1 week, in the few months before the IPO. So there was he was very intense about work and working all the time in some ways, and then also surfing all the time and smoking a lot of pot. And I don't know, there's this crazy mix of things somehow. Which did not work.
It really reminded me of a band on tour, like Led Zeppelin or something. You're performing at arguably an elite level and you're doing something productive, but the ego, the habits, the lifestyle just seems so excessive and in some ways reckless. So I just couldn't stop thinking of that analogy as I was reading through your book. But you mentioned WeCrashed, and I do want to get into that because I know we exchanged notes ahead of this, and it sounds like you watched it. I did as well. I was pretty impressed by the acting, the writing. I thought it was very well done, but obviously it doesn't follow reality, in a completely faithful way. So I would love to hear about your reaction to their depiction and maybe where they got it right, where they got it wrong, what the kind of most meaningful deviations might be in terms of fiction versus reality as well.
Sure. So overall, I agree. I thought the acting was pretty incredible, especially, both Anne Hathaway and Jared Leto. I feel like I almost will never think of either one of them again without thinking of their depictions of them. And I've talking to people, especially with Jared Leto, they all say like the accent, people, I mean, I've listened to Adam and met him, but even people close to him were like, he got the accent like totally spot on. Rebecca maybe a little less so, but it's like, it's just an interesting depiction. I thought it was really, it was just very well done with her too. Very broad brushstrokes. I thought overall they did a really amazing job too of sort of getting the whole arc of the story and getting a lot of the aspects of the business story right, yet making it like interesting for TV. I just thought like they sort of, it's such a delicate balance. And having struggled with that in our book, like how much to put in and how to make it tangible for a broader audience, but to depict it the way they did, I was like really impressed. At times I sort of laughed, like some things they over dramatized a little bit, that were not that exciting. And then, but sometimes they under dramatized really crazy stuff. I don't know, maybe they were just missing some of the details. So it was funny, but then a lot of times my husband had read the book and had, followed the story as all steps of the way. But sometimes he was like, that didn't happen, right? I'm like, no, that actually really happened. Like, and that I don't have at my fingertips, but maybe you can mention some things. But two characters I thought, I'll just say, like, were interesting, but not right. Like, the character of Miguel, we kind of struggled with him a bit in the book because he obviously founded the company. He was like an important part early on, but he became more and more marginalized. So people sort of joked in our book that he just like pop up at random points, but that also felt like kind of what he was like in the arc of the WeWork trajectory. Like he had a lesser and lesser role, kind of took on different jobs. But I thought the guy who played him, the actor, I think he did a great job. But they basically put the character of like the CFO, his like COO, they put all those things into Miguel, and Miguel did like very few of those things. He did.
So Artie Minson was
Yes.
Also Miguel, yeah.
Yeah, and a few other characters. And even with Rebecca, it's interesting. Like I thought we struggled a lot when we were writing the book with how much to put in of her, because we did a lot of reporting, and she's like an unbelievably fascinating character. And I think she did loom so large in his life and his psyche, and made him dream bigger. But then she did, I mean, they had 5 kids while he ran WeWork. So she would leave for big points of time, then come in and do some of the things that they depicted in the show. But I don't think sometimes she was more in the middle of the story than she really was, though she did play a significant role at points.
It's interesting, the sort of redeeming qualities that their relationship gives the story in the show. Where they are pretty horrible to most people outside of their relationship and their family, but they are at the end of the day, seemingly at least, sincerely devoted to each other. And I would imagine their kids. And it does complicate the instinct to kind of paint either one of them as a villain in a way that I thought was very artful. So, that's kind of what I took away from it as well.
I totally agree. And that was like, everything we always heard was like, there's something, and I mean, it sounds like they still are, married. They had another child after this all happened. And there was sort of not much daylight between them, and they were like very in sync and it was like a grand vision that they shared. And I'm sure, some of it was dramatized clearly, but some of the moments where she was frustrated and left alone, and he was that, I mean, some of that definitely was the case too. where she struggled to have like, I mean, she wanted to be in the middle of everything too. And then he suddenly was like, the fame was all on him. And it does sound like she kind of struggled with that and got her own like PR team and all of that.
Yeah, the passages in your book about We Grow and some of the micromanaging there, and also just the kind of classic Rebecca-isms in terms of the soulful, universal, galactic nature, godlike nature of everything that she was talking about, definitely stuck with me. And they went into that a little bit in the show. In some ways, I almost would have liked to have seen more. But I do want to get into some of your favorite anecdotes, and just a quick pause for folks in the audience. We are going to leave some time for Q&A in just a little bit. So if you do have any questions for Maureen that you would like us to go through, just enter them in that Zoom Q&A bubble down at the bottom of your screen, or you can do it via Twitter. I will try and look at that as well. But before we do that, is there anything that has surprised you about, I guess, sort of the evolution of this story or the public's reaction to it? Like, did you expect, when you first started covering WeWork, for it to have the potential to become this incredible book, this talked about series, and who knows what else is in store for it? I don't know, you would probably have a better idea, but I would love to just get a sense of your reaction to the reaction.
It felt like there was something like crazy, like it did feel like there's something a little different and more intense about Adam Newman and everything else than the other startups that were still larger. I mean, Travis Kalanick, and obviously there's a show about him too right now. I mean, it's this era with these huge personalities, huge amounts of money. That's, probably most likely over, but who knows? But yeah, but it was surprising. I think just how swiftly it fell was absolutely shocking, and none of us could have possibly seen that coming. I mean, it seemed overvalued, but it seemed like it would probably go public and it wouldn't be a great IPO, like might fall down the road or something. So I think just the way it all played out from like September 1st on was so shocking, and so much like you're just in real time trying to digest everything, or barely digesting it, just getting it out there and then having some time to digest it. So no, I don't think we could have ever foreseen it. And then, yeah, how it kind of captured like what else would be there. I mean, once that started happening, Eliot and I started talking about a book. We literally spent like a weekend talking about it a little bit. We wrote a paragraph and then made a book deal like 2 days later. It was kind of crazy how quickly that happened. And our show was optioned to the Apple TV thing. It just went quicker. So I don't think there's room for 2 shows. Who knows, maybe someday. But I think especially that they did such a good job makes that trickier. But yeah, I don't know. It's pretty wild. As you said, you talked about the rock band aspect of it. We thought that too a lot of times. Like, he just had this swagger, and I felt like even on the way up, what they captured in the show very nicely is like how an entrepreneur literally becomes like a rock star. Like when you see him in in the camp scenes, and like what he would do on stage. I mean, he helped create that. I mean, they've spent the money and put him on stage and put him next to celebrities, and but people sort of bought into him like that. Everyone from many of the huge amount of employees to bankers to, I don't know, he just kind of became this larger than life figure.
It is amazing the comprehensiveness with which he seemed to influence people. Another one of my favorite anecdotes, Goldman's path to 1 trillion. This is Goldman Sachs, who, as I'm sure we all know, is the most venerable investment bank on Wall Street, is with a straight face in an official deck showing him the path to $1 trillion in valuation, like they're Apple or Facebook or something. And it's a real estate company. Like it is just, there is no one seemingly, except for maybe Morgan Stanley, who he was not able to, bring into his insane reality.
And they also had Mother Teresa in the pitch deck. They managed to weave her into it. And Bob Marley, there are references to, like,
Yep.
the figure he was in real life. So yeah, all of that became sorry, that was just my daughter. That all sort of figured into it and was just so like when we got our hands on the pitch deck, like, oh my God, like what people
it's unbelievable
to convince him in a way that it's hard to imagine, just like all the role reversal of like how things worked, to how everyone was like, he sort of ruled Wall Street for a while until he didn't, basically, with calling Jamie Dimon his personal banker.
Yeah, very good at pitting, big banks and big organizations and big egos sort of against each other for, his own and WeWork's own benefit, it seemed like, as well. Any other anecdotes that were among your favorites, either those that made it into the show or book or didn't?
Speaking of Goldman Sachs, I mean, one of my favorites was there was once they were going to give, there was like a big, sorry, it's just loud outside of my, I hope you can hear this.
It's New York.
Yeah. There was this giant debt deal. He was playing the banks off against each other, and Goldman Sachs was going to give him a huge amount of money that maybe could have kept him from the company from going public, which is something he really seemed to want. He seemed very fearful of the public markets for, as we saw what happened. And then they sort of, hemmed and hawed at the end and maybe couldn't give him the money. And then it turned out Goldman really wanted to lead the IPO, and so did JP Morgan. And, we started hearing about this like push that they made at the very end. And this was like over the summer, two bankers, he called off the debt deal. He said they weren't giving him exactly what he wanted, and they were not going to run the IPO at all anymore. It was going to be JP Morgan. The bankers were so upset that two of them went to Adam Newman's house in the Hamptons. And I couldn't even believe this was real when I heard this. But they go and try to like beg him to take their deal. Like they'll do anything. They want to really convince him. These two very senior bankers at Goldman Sachs. So he said, "Oh, okay, come into my like my sauna. We'll like talk about it." So it's him and like a senior executive there. They go in, and then he's like, "When I finish, we'll go into an ice bath." So the bankers, they have to go to the sauna, ice bath. And basically one of the bankers says, like jokingly, maybe not, you're not supposed to go in the ice bath for more than like a minute. He basically says like, "I'm not coming out," or like, I can stay in this ice bath longer than like, you have to take my deal or I'm not coming out. And they had like took pictures of him, and it just seemed like the way that Adam got people to like behave. It's like everything was kind of like a frat hazing or something.
I mean, these are some of the most powerful, with the most incredible resumes, Ivy League, whatever you want to say, successful people in investment banking who are doing such undignified things to get Adam Newman's attention and, business. And it is just consistent, and it's amazing. And that is, I think, a great illustration of it, which is in your book, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to see
I will say the fact that, I mean, it seems almost like a universal inevitability to, maybe be a little bit like Rebecca here, that Masa and Adam met and had the sort of interwoven narrative that they did, given that it seems like they just fed off of each other in terms of creating their own reality. And the fact that Masa could sit there and say, Adam is not crazy enough, and then sort of taunt him with other founders. The Oyo founder, his little brother is beating him, and push him to be even more reckless and take even more money and spend even more money is also just remarkable to me. And the way that SoftBank kind of fuels the final, third of the story is, it is hard for me to step back and remember that a lot of this is reality, which I think is what's wonderful about your book, just how fiction-like it often feels.
Yeah, we always joke that we could never have you could never make up stories as insane as what really happened in this story. And for these two characters, I mean, it was funny, people who knew both of them, Masa had been pitched on WeWork a few times internally and was like, meh. And then they happened to meet in India, and it was like, the minute they met, and then they met again, he went on that famous 12-minute tour of WeWork, gave him $4 billion. But yeah, people said there's just no way they won't join forces. Like, no one's ever met anyone like the two of them.
It is. I think this was maybe mentioned in the New York Times review, but it truly does feel on the level of Greek myth. The kinds of things that happen in this story. I do want to get into one of the audience questions, which leads me to where I kind of wanted to go anyway. So one of the audience members asks what your thoughts are on Adam's new blockchain venture, and I wanted to explore, maybe not specifically that, but what you think the future might hold for these folks, because it does look like he's raised $75 million from Andreessen Horowitz. Obviously, it's a blockchain startup, and I don't know that on Wall Street or in Silicon Valley, these kinds of things are, everybody can reinvent themselves. Like, we know many, many examples. So I would be curious just to get your take on what you think the future might look like for Adam and others in your story.
I think we will see him again and again. I don't know if it'll be this. I mean, I think he's one of the co-founders of this, and Rebecca too. I think I saw her on this.
Yeah, and Elon, it looks like his kind of personal banker or whatever he had been. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, but I think they're going to be very active. I mean, he walked away essentially with almost $1 billion from the company. At the end of it, I think it's largely cashed out. I'm going to mix up the numbers at this point, but he has a very sizable, not paper fortune, like actual real fortune right now that he's sitting on. And so I think, at the very least, he's going to keep on making a lot of investments. It seems like he has a family office. He has this sort of venerable banker running it for him, Elon Stern, who worked for General Catalyst and other places. And I think they're going to just stay active no matter what. But and this is just conjecture, I can't imagine him not going after a giant second act. I think they'll dabble in various things. It seems like they're working on things in residential real estate, other sort of climate things. I constantly have people telling me various things he's working on. But then from what everyone says, if knew Adam, and you can see this from the book, and he was, even in WeWork when he was the CEO of it, they were working on 100 different things. Someone told me, someone who worked with him was Adam had more legit $1 billion ideas in his head than anyone I've ever met. He's brilliant. He's incredibly entrepreneurial. And as you said, a comeback story. You would think he would be persona non grata, maybe on Wall Street after this, but I don't think so. I think people are going to want to back him. They think he can still do something big again. plus he doesn't need money in the same way he did in the past. Like he can put a lot of his own money at his disposal to do whatever he wants next. But I don't
Yeah.
think he has the ability, nor does Rebecca, in fairness, to stay out of the public eye for too long. Like I think they're both a little too obsessed with that. Like they're gonna need something more.
Certainly makes sense and aligns with my read on them as characters, based on your book. I have one more question. I do want to make sure that we get you out of here shortly, but I do want to point to Oliver's question here in the Q&A. And so he mentions that Reuters reported that the SEC and maybe the New York Attorney General's office were investigating him over self-dealing and misrepresentation of financials. Was there anything that happened in terms of those investigations or any other kind of ongoing overhanging legal issues that he might be facing as well?
It seems like they've all kind of faded away. It seemed like all those investigations were going on. It's a great question, but I hadn't heard any more on any of it for a long time. And I mean, the interesting thing is, a lot of people just to throw out there the Theranos comparison, another TV show, which I'm getting through right now. Granted, obviously people's lives were at stake, but there was like true misrepresentation and hiding and lying about things. I would say with the case, there's questions on the margins of sometimes when what he told the public and investors and everybody else. But, they had some very smart lawyers. Also, one of the things that I think Eliot and I saw while writing the book in much more great detail was, the projections were so pie in the sky and were like ridiculous when you look back at them. They were going to be profitable, like to such an extreme degree, like the next year constantly throughout. But it was like, these were some of the most sophisticated investors in the world, got all this material. They got the previous statements. Like there wasn't that much lying. Like they were allowing themselves to be diluted, I think, in a lot of cases. So yeah, so nothing's ever come of those. But I think to a certain extent, a lot of like sad things happen in this company. Maybe it could have been bigger and better. And, these people could have, Adam took a lot out of the company, got a lot, and a lot of people didn't. But in terms of like outright fraud, I won't say maybe they'll still find something. It was just not so clear cut, even though it didn't look great. But I think a lot of people just followed him blindly, even though they had reason to maybe doubt him.
It is amazing. I mean, a lot of it above board, if not all of it, willing participants, incredibly sophisticated investors, and just the most unusual, extreme versions of the kinds of things that happen in fast-growing startups that you can imagine. Like it really is that story, that kind of archetypal successful startup story on steroids in every way. And at the end of the day, without really, a defensible, a way to defend their valuation, which got, multiples ahead of where it should be and where it is today. Last question I want to go into is sort of, what are you interested in today? What's next? I know you're now at the New York Times. You've been there for less than a year. Have read some great investigative pieces that you've authored. The one on Bolt, it certainly comes to mind. So would just be curious to hear about what you're up to next and kind of where your interests lay.
Sure. So I'm going to continue maternity leave for a few months, hang out with my kids for the summer. So it'll be interesting. It feels like, and I'm curious if you see this too, it feels like things could be so different by the time I come back from my leave in August, September. Things seem like they're happening very quickly all over the place, but especially like in Silicon Valley. These private companies, like the valuations are crumbling, the layoffs are happening really quickly. So I guess I kind of want to take a lay of the land and figure out if, there are more reworks and bolts, or, what's going to happen to these like venture firms and the crossover funds that raise, like the Tiger Globals of the world. Eliot just had a good piece on that a week or so ago, like, and another colleague, former colleague of mine, Julia Chung, just
down 50%, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, and they had raised like just so much more money than firms ever like could have dreamed of. So I think kind of, if there's, I don't know if it's going to be carnage or what it's going to be like, but I think it's just going to be an absolutely fascinating story to cover, like what happens next in Silicon Valley and in tech world, and kind of the capital markets in general. And would love any tips as I start coming back of interesting things to cover too.
Everybody should remember to send Maureen their tips on juicy business happenings. Yeah, but probably not client pitches. I don't think, I would imagine these days, it's probably bad news if we're, getting calls from Maureen, which is appropriate. Okay. But I do want to end it here. Maureen, you've been so gracious with your time, and it was great to speak with you and go through everything related to this incredible book and your amazing reporting. Folks in the audience, please do remember to buy the book. You will not regret it. It is amazing, and you will read it in 4 sittings max. It's that good. So thank you again for your time, Maureen. Hope to see you soon, and wish you all the best in the meantime.
Thank you so much. This is a fun conversation.
Awesome.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Thanks. Have a good night. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, JJ.